What's up, bookworms? This is Megan coming at you with another Cantina conversation. Today's episode features a chat with Linda Ambrus Broenniman. We are talking about her book, The Politzer Saga, that is available now. So this is a nonfiction piece, just generations of her family history, going back to before World War II, kind of just discovering that, she was raised as a Catholic, and in her late 20s, she discovered that her family's actually Jewish. And during the conversation, just finding out details about how they were her family, her relatives had been keeping secrets. Even decades later, they're still really secretive about some of the things that they had to go through to survive. And it was just really fascinating to hear about her family history and how she put all the evidence and stories together. It's really fascinating. I'll let you guys take a look. Here is Linda. Okay, so today we've got Linda Ambrus Broenniman. We're talking about her book, The Politzer Saga. That book is available now. Thank you, Linda, for chatting with me today. This book is fresh in my brain. There's a lot. There's so much going on. It's such a fascinating story, and I'm excited to dig a little bit deeper today.
Well, Megan, thank you so much for having me. I really am honored to be on your show. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. So to get started, can you share a summary of the book so that people can kind of follow along with the conversation?
Sure, but before I do that, let me back up a little bit and tell you about the origins of the book. So, when I was 27 years old, I found out that what I thought about my family wasn't true. So, I grew up in a family of, my parents were Catholic Hungarian parents who had survived World War II and came to the U.S. in 1949, December 1949, to start a new life. And we grew up in Buffalo. I was one of seven. And I thought, we had a great childhood. And here I thought I was the daughter of Catholic Hungarian parents. And then when I was 27, I accidentally found out that my father was Jewish. But at the time, I really didn't do anything about it. And it took me really until about 8 years ago to finally do something. And part of the instigation of that was in 2011, my parents' house caught fire. And miraculously, there was a box that was saved. And in it, and that box actually took a long time to finally make it to my doorstep. But about 5 or 6 years later, my sister sent me the box after finding it in the back of one of her closets. And when I opened it, I found documents and letters and photographs, and some of them were, from the late 1800s. And the documents and the letters were all in Hungarian, which I didn't speak. I tried to use Google Translate to translate it, and trust me, it doesn't work. Hungarian's a really tough language, but it didn't work. So I ended up having to find somebody that could help me out. And through a friend of a friend, I ended up collaborating with András Kazicki, who was just a brilliant sleuth. He was a Hungarian lawyer and sociologist and an amazing person. And we started really an 8-year collaboration learning about the stories of my family. And part of it came from the letters and the documents that were in the box. But then András would take these and just, that was the start of a long journey in which he found so many things, both, online. He would go to cemeteries. He would find these ancient registers. And he was just an amazing sleuth. And we pieced together the stories of 8 generations of my father's Hungarian Jewish family. So dating all the way back to the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 1700s, and then really up to present day. And I'll be honest with you, Megan, I was not intending to write a book. I was really just trying to find out my family's history. And then, but as we started to uncover these stories, I realized my history was not up to par at all. And I went to private school, so you thought I would have a really good education, but no, I really needed to dive deep into reading history books and biographies of that time and so on. And so I needed a way to organize it and sort of understand these people in the context of their times. So the best way to do that was for me to write it, and that's how the book came about. And as Andras really, said, he said, this is a remarkable history of Hungarian Jews from the Austro-Hungarian Empire to present day. And these stories and the characters, I mean, they're almost like fictional characters. They're just amazing people of what they've lived through and how they responded and reacted. And so I thought, putting in a book was it was very a true gift to me. It was great for me, and as others started to look at it, they said, yeah, it was really something that needed to be shared.
Yeah, I imagine it was therapeutic maybe to an
Yes,
extent.
it was.
Yeah.
It really
Yeah,
was.
just to like, I don't know, I can't imagine like the psyche that you were going through, like, or the context of the situation where you were like, wait a second, like in your late 20s, and you're like, okay. And then and then when you find out like the physical evidence, like the pieces, the photos, the messages, like it's here, this was real. I imagine that was just like you're like, "Okay, I gotta dig a little bit deeper and wait a second, there's something here." Otherwise, like, I imagine it was gonna not leave you alone in your brain until
You're
you
so right.
pursued. Yeah.
You're so right. But looking back on it, there's some regret there because my father kept these amazing people secret from me from a long time, and I think about my grandmother. So my grandmother left Hungary in 1956 after the 56 revolution, and then came to live with us, and she never said a word. And when I think about her, she was born in 1902, so she would have known some of these amazing characters. And had I been able to get some of the stories directly from her, it would have been, I think, so much richer and so on. So a little bit of regret
Yeah,
there.
I guess it's just kinda like you gotta accept the what if, like, "Oh, I could have gotten this commentary, or I could have gotten this little tidbits, these details a little bit more authentically," but then, I don't know, I guess you just kinda have to deal with it and
Exactly.
'cause you use what you have,
Yes. I mean, I can't,
Yeah.
on the one hand, it would have been nice, but I also now understand a little bit more about my father and why he felt a need to keep these secrets. So,
Yeah, yeah. So like I got the impression that nobody mentioned anything about it to you, like even amongst were there multiple family members that knew and it was kind of like an agreed upon secret, like nobody like okay, we're that's past, we're not going to talk about it. Let's move on. Don't tell the kids.
yeah, exactly.
you
Well,
know.
yeah, my father knew, obviously. My father and my mother would have known. My mother, I'm sure, knew everything because I think she read some of the source material actually. She knew, and my mother actually hid my father and my grandmother during the war. So my mother knew, my grandmother knew, and I know that there were other, visitors that would come visit us that my parents knew from Hungary, and I'm sure they knew, but there was this, wide kept secret. Nobody talked about it. And I think, part of it is nobody, that generation didn't like to talk about the trauma that they experienced during the war. But I think there was also more to it that, my father had lived through incredible anti-Semitism, and I think also
Mm,
feared that it could reemerge. And here we are when we look at where we are today.
yeah.
His fears were not unwarranted. So
Yeah, I guess yeah, it's part of like it's not it goes deeper than generational trauma because I've talked to authors who historical fiction novels that they write are inspired by their own family history, where like maybe they decide to do something like you, but then they're like, no, maybe I want to do this instead, and so they do kind of a story based on what they found. And a lot of it is like they found out that their ancestors kind of kept it hush hush, maybe not so much of the shame, but like for survival. They're just still used to that, like that subconscious like fight or flight response. Like, no, we're gonna keep, even though we're in America and this is fine, like everything's okay. It's not like it was in this country 30, 40 years ago. It's still like that innate like the protection, their survival instinct, where they don't talk about it, and they don't even if it's people from like your generation or generations below that who are want to know about it, they like are asking questions, and they're still visibly like apprehensive or uncomfortable. They're not sure about it. It's just because I think that was so ingrained to them that they had to keep those details hush hush, because they don't like, even after reading of this your family members' stories, it was just like in smaller towns everybody knew what you were, and then it was like when these things happened, when these forces came in or when these historical events happened, then couldn't anticipate like keeping that secret. It was like it wasn't a secret, and then they were, they were left out to dry almost, or even if they had their neighbors who were still trying to give them a heads up or protect them, it was still, they didn't anticipate that need to like hide or survival or things like that. It was really hard to anticipate. At least that's the gist that I got within a lot of like what you found and you presented in your book.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and during the Holocaust, I mean, it's interesting because my mother, it, you know, people, friends betrayed friends, and they were actually paid by the Nazis to inform on one
Yeah.
another. So my parents lived through a time where they felt like they couldn't trust others, even if they
How
were
terrifying.
friends. So I think that
Yeah.
must have played into some of it also.
So then they're like their own kids are asking about it. They're like
Yeah, exactly. Don't, we're not going to go there. We're not going to talk
they're
about
like,
it.
no, I don't have to tell you anything. Like
Right, right.
yeah, it's just like so fascinating because you're not far off. I feel like your experience, it's just even as unique as it is and as horrible as your family's experience and interesting and fascinating as it is. I see a lot of parallels, not just from today, but from like people from like their ancestry is from like across the world too, where it's similar. Like I just spoke to an author where their grandmother lived in Korea when it was occupied by Japan, leading up to World War II. And it was so crazy because, like, her grandmother's childhood is they were already occupied, but then they had to, like, travel to Japan to get more, like, opportunities because they weren't available in Korea. And then they had a tingle with that identity. Like, they were like, well, they can pass as Japan, Japanese, but then they like had to switch between Japanese and Korean names, and it just reminds me of that, where they were like just survival, and they were trying to assimilate, and then they were like, it was so tricky where they couldn't get jobs because of it, and it remind like a lot of stuff that I read in your story, where it's just like they were building up businesses and they were successful, but then there were like political and societal obstacles where they were like not allowed to, just because they were Jewish. And like to me that's just like that's a shame. Like present day of what I understand of it anyway, all that aside, it's a shame. At the very base of it, it's just like that I can't imagine that restriction on me having to go through that, And so reading it about it with your family's history, it was just like I just remember certain pages. I was just like it was kind of like building me up, and then I was like I just threw my hands up, and I was like because I would get, like kind of like you're building it up, and you're like, oh yeah, this is what their life was like in this. They were successful. I think there was one family member of yours that stood out to me as where they didn't do well in school and they were bouncing around. They're like brothers who were like 10 years older than them. They were bouncing around like trying to figure out what to do with their lives because they weren't good in school and they couldn't like focus, but people just thought that they were lazy. And then
they ended up still making something of themselves.
Yeah.
And then
You're referring
some, you know,
To Zygmunt
yeah.
Politzer.
See, you
Yes.
know. I imagine, you know, like even like what your 40 family members amongst your like family tree, you know, like exactly who.
Yeah, so Zygmunt's such an interesting case too, because just as you
Mm,
said, and part of it was, his father, who was an amazing. Abraham was amazing. Abraham had 14 kids, and Zygmunt was the second youngest, and he died when Zygmunt was 12. So you think about, the impact of his father dying on him, I think, which is
yeah.
why he didn't do well in school, and then he gets bounced around to all of his older brothers, and they don't treat him very well either. But he learned his lessons, and Zygmunt became one of the most incredible entrepreneurs who really contributed to this explosion, the golden era of Budapest, building Budapest. And he was a banker, he was an investor, he invested very early on in automobiles and in railroads, and he became enormously wealthy. So here was this kid who everyone
Yeah.
thought was lazy and was a no good, but yet he becomes one of the most successful in the family.
I know. It's so funny. It's good to know that like those trends are still like they transcend like generations. It's just like don't write him off yet. You never know. Like maybe he just doesn't do good in a classroom setting. It's like, yeah.
Yeah, we're all just people, right? And just as you said, history repeats itself, and I think
Yeah.
we all go through, similar kind. Many of us go through similar kinds of things. So he lived back in the 1800s, and I think died in 1920. And here you still see so many examples of the same kind of behavior. So
Mhm.
yeah, we're
Mhm.
all just human.
It's a little comforting, and then it's a little bit telling because it's just like what not only generations but like across the world.
Yes,
It's
exactly.
like it's just humans. It's just human nature, and it could be genetic or it could just be human nature and all that. Because I think I related to him a little bit because even though I always did like well in school, I think I can just understand that on that level where he not only did he have like you know like family stuff to deal with and because at a certain age it's like your brain is developing and the stress that you're under will alter your brain development and how you're developing as an adolescent and it's so crazy because it has so many implications for I mean I'm not going to jump down any rabbit holes here but you get the idea where it's like it can affect how you live your life and how you learn and how you know regulate your emotions and your education and your knowledge based on any trauma that you may or may have not experienced at a young age and so it was so interesting and it was kind of like I could relate to him just or it was like something to apply to current day, like something that I was familiar with. So it was just like, okay, I get you.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
He was an amazing guy too. I mean, he titled it Our Family History, and so that's where we got a lot of the early stories. But you
That's
could
amazing.
tell out of what he wrote, how he was a family man, and he loved his family, and family was everything to him. So he's an amazing character in the whole.
Yeah. I think I know. I feel like yeah, obviously you couldn't tell your family history without including him because you jump around, right? Like you jump because there's like little branches off of depending on the children and the siblings. And I appreciated your family tree. I appreciated the sections of your family tree depending on how you were who you were talking about because there were like I just remember there were so many names and then there were so many spellings of those names depending on what you how you had to research for them, how you had to find them because then there was like, yeah, there's 5 people of this name, but then there's one person but then there's also one person who's named this, but there's maybe like 3 different spellings of his name because he or she was bouncing around 3 different countries or spelling it different ways for survival and it's just all those little nuances are just like so fascinating to me. And I imagine that was added to the project for
Yeah,
you.
well, that was a huge challenge in the research because just as you said, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the official language was actually Latin. But when you
Mm,
think about the countries that made up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I mean, it was huge. There was Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, and parts of Poland and parts of Ukraine. I mean, it was enormous. And so you had all these different languages. And so there were different spellings depending where you were. And the same person, just as you said, Zygmunt could be spelled like five different ways, and then Politzer could be spelled five different
yeah,
ways. And you're referring to the same person. So
yeah.
that was a huge challenge in the research, making sure that we had the right
That
person.
Yeah, because I even like saying Zygmunt, it's like I read as Zygmunt, but I'm like, oh, that could have been spelled as very phonetically Sigmund.
Exactly, exactly. And it was
Yeah,
in certain
yeah,
cases, in many cases.
yeah.
So, yeah, it was a huge challenge.
I know. I just feel some of that stuff is so fascinating to me because it's like, some people who are entering America and they're like, people who are recording their entries are like, well, that's not going to work. We're just going to change the spelling because otherwise people will know that you're from like my husband, his family, when they were coming to America, they were Bianchi, Bianchi. When they came, they were like, his employer at the time, wherever his ancestor found work, they were like, well, we have Irish people here, and Irish and Italians don't get along, so we're gonna just change you to Bianc. Like Biank. Their employer changed their name so that to like minimize the issue. And so if you look on, like, yeah, if we look, because I remember we went to Italy, like a 2 week long trip to Italy, and we met up with some of their families, and it was interesting because they kept track of their stuff, like all their family trees, like your family had, or well, you had to dig into it, but they say similar thing where there was like one or two people who were diligently keeping track of it. And it was just crazy to see how, okay, like where does that lead us to? Like, where does that lead you guys to? How far back can you go? And it's, I imagine with Jewish family, it was so much more complicated because I remember speaking to a Black woman who she wrote like a kind of time travel historical fiction. It was based on where she found out that her like ancestor, like her great great grandmother or whoever that appropriate level was, who had she learned about her because she had, once she was freed, she purchased land, she purchased property. And when she was talking about it, she was talking about how hard it was for her to find any other relatives because there was a point where there's no records because they were just considered as property. They weren't considered as people. And so like reading a lot of what you found out in your family history reminded me of that, where there's just no record of it because of marginalization and just history and
And destruction. Yeah, purposeful destruction of the records.
exactly.
I mean, I think I was a little bit lucky in that a lot of my relatives were lawyers, and so they ended up making copies of some of the important like documents because they had to. There were so many times, like in 1938, they had to prove that they had lived in Hungary for X number of years. Otherwise, as a Jew, they could have been
Mm.
expelled. And so there were times like that where they just had to keep repeating and proving that they were who they were and that they had lived and paid taxes and all of that. And so, as lawyers, I think they kept some of those documents, and those are some of the documents that I found in the box.
Okay. That's so cool. I imagine that was so exhausting for them.
Very exhausting, very exhausting. I mean, there's one letter I found that my great grandmother and it was really a sad letter. It was she had to she contacted the rabbi from a town where her husband was from, which was maybe about an hour south of Budapest. But the rabbi wrote back and he said, "Oh, things are so bad. If you can give me any money to pay for his proof of these documents, because he was finding it, difficult to even support
Oh
his
wow.
family because they were just under such a horrible conditions, so such oppression, and they weren't
Yeah.
allowed to, there were these quotas that only 5% of Jews were allowed to, go to school. 5% of Jews were allowed to be lawyers, and I mean there were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that were put out of work, and not only Jews, but now they weren't allowed to have Christian workers or Christian household servants, or so it wasn't only the Jews that were put out of work, but hundreds of thousands of other people, and it was really dark
And was
times.
it just like control? Because I guess if they weren't like targeting a specific group and they were just
Well, the Nazis
picking
were
picking and
targeting
choosing.
Jews. They were targeting
Yeah.
Jews, so they did. But what happened is, a lot of Jews had, like my great great grandfather Ignaz. He had a housekeeper for 27 years that he had to let go. So things like
That's
it's the
so
ripple effect,
heartbreaking.
right?
Yeah. But I read some of that where like they built, like I mentioned before, where they're building up their wealth and they're building their life, and then they have to be resourceful to like hide. And I think one of your first stories early on where he just refused to give any information and he was died from torture, and that was like so heartbreaking because it was just like, what do you do? It's just like he must have like resolved like, I'm gonna, if I'm gonna die, I'm not gonna give them anything. It's like that which is so important and so brave, because any person who could be like I said, fight or flight, like they could survive. They just want to survive. But then again, it's like, you know what? I'm probably not much better off anyway. I'm gonna do what I can. It's just like I just imagine, like, because I don't have anything to like relate to that experience. So I'm like, what would I do in that situation? I'm like, I have no idea. Like, I have no idea,
But
you
just
know?
as you said, when you think about it, had he given up, and I think you're referring to Moritz, who was tortured and then killed by Napoleon soldiers.
Yeah. Like he was like in a coma because he was, yeah, and then he didn't wake up, and yeah.
And so,
Mhm.
but had he given out the location of his valuables, they probably would have killed him anyway. So
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
really hard
And good
circumstance.
instincts on him, I guess, unfortunately,
Yeah, yeah, and what a waste because he was considered an incredible doctor, and we're going back to the late 1700s, and so
Yeah,
doctors.
sorry, we're jumping around
Yeah,
all your
no, it's
timelines here.
okay, but think
I'm
about.
keeping you on your toes. Yeah.
Uh, doctors were few and far between, and he was considered, one of the best. And people used to send their carriages from Vienna to bring him so he could take care of them. So, what a waste. I mean, he sounded like
It
just an
was.
incredible man. And
Because I medical practice was a kind of a trend in your family. It was,
yeah.
yeah,
Yes.
to say the least, right?
Yes.
And so, yeah, and it's everybody, no matter what, like that's one thing that my dad always taught me. He's like, any field you want to get into, like everyone's gonna need to be fed, everyone needs to get taken care of. So like health and food are solid bets. It's and healthcare, it's so important. It's like, unfortunately, as politicized and bureaucratic it's become, at the end of the day, it's such a good skill to have, just to like know. Yeah, and it's like I'm lucky enough to have some friends who are in the field, and so without even thinking, I'll be like, hey, like, like I'll reach out to them. And so like I imagine like what you just kind of echoing off of what you said, it's a loss. And it sounded like a lot of people in your family, at least from what you gathered and you put on the page, they were resilient and they were kind and they were like determined and they had all these admirable qualities, and for them to just, the world to miss out on those contributions because of some, pardon my French, some bullshit like prejudices, some bullshit drama that people just make up, and their quest for power. And it's unfortunately, it's just like what we've seen time and time again across the globe. It's not like isolated to Europe, it's not isolated to America. It's so like you can almost pinpoint like any point. You could pick a point in history, you could pick a point in on the map, and find something.
Yeah, well, I think,
It's
just as you said, just to sort of continue that thread, I think it's the dehumanization of any kind of, so, in the U.S. it was blacks and, Native Americans, quite frankly.
yeah.
And in the days of the Holocaust, it was Jews. So anytime you pinpoint a small group and then dehumanize them and create hate and fear, then you can sort of whip up you know the masses, shall we say. But then you don't realize how much you lose. It's
Yeah.
unbelievable, the talent and the one thing about, I know my family, and I think this is true in the Jewish religion. There is such a core value is to serve humanity and to try to leave the world a better place. And those are the kinds of people we need. Not, you don't want to
Yeah.
dehumanize them.
100%.
Yeah.
Although, I guess it, because I'm sure there are people in history who thought they were a better place, even though it was like, no, like you are making horrible decisions and affecting masses of people for generations to come. It's like what they would be like, oh no, but this is what we need. It's like just no. Like, and I that reminds me another one of your family members who you said who were a lawyer, and they were, I'm sorry if I don't remember all the names, but I just remember specific parts that stood out to me. One your ancestors who was a lawyer who he made a point to try to reconcile between his clients before hashing out negotiations. He was like, no, half of the time it's just like hate, or it's just like they're mad and they're angry. And he was absolutely right. Like, I think there's just like so many emotions when going into those types of things. And it's like once that's hashed out, then people can be more reasonable. And it's just like they can kind of like agree to disagree on a mature level. And so I thought that was like that's something that stood out to me. It was one of your family members who was like a lawyer who did that. I was like, we need more people like that too.
Yes, I mean he was an amazing person, right? So that was Ignaz Misner, and he was my
Mhm.
great grandfather, and he was born, I think, in 1856, I think, and he died at the age of 99. And who knows if he would have lived longer, but he died of starvation in the ghetto
Mm,
after,
mm.
and when you think about him.
That's remarkable. Like, it wasn't like natural causes. Like, no, he.
No, no, not at all. And
That's wild.
literally 10 years before that, so in 1934, he died in 1944. In 1934, he had been celebrated and honored because he was one of the founders of the Budapest Bar Association. So he had become a lawyer during, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when, it was still the empire. And then he was largely, after World War One, when the empire was split up, he was largely responsible for a lot of the foundational laws for Hungary. And so you have this man who was celebrated and so on, and then 10 years later he dies of starvation in the Jewish ghetto.
Was he the one that was like he had dementia, and then he was they were kind of passing him around, and then he was found wandering.
Yes,
Oh,
yeah. His daughter, my great grandmother Margie, tried to save him, and because he started having dementia, then she put him in a retirement home where she thought he was safe, but then he was found wandering, and then they put him in the hospital in the
that's
Jewish
so
ghetto.
sad.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah. But
like,
an amazing man, just an amazing man,
yeah.
and in Budapest, what was unique about Budapest is a lot of the Jews, rather than being in a ghetto, at first they were forced to give up their homes and go to what was called a Yellow Star house. And the Yellow Star
Hmm.
houses were horrible because they were basically preparing them for deportation anyway. But what happened is, really, either mothers and young children or the elderly lived there because all the young, able-bodied men and women were in forced labor camps, and they were constantly harassed by the Arrow Cross, and really suffered such deprivation and starvation and so on. But at any rate, so they had taken his home. He had to they lived in this gigantic apartment building, and all the apartments were inhabited by family members, and all the family had to go into one room in the Yellow Star House. So he wrote to Governor Horthy, who was the leader of Hungary at the time, and whom he knew, and he wrote asking to get his house back, and for getting an exemption from all of these horrible Jewish laws. And he actually did get the exemption, but it came too late. At that point, Nazis had sort of removed Horthy from power and took over. But he refused to take the Yellow Star off. And he said he wanted to wear it as a matter of pride. And so that sort of said so much to me about he had such faith and core values, and he really believed in truth and justice, and just an amazing, amazing man. Amazing man.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I remember, yeah, that was definitely one of the points that stood out to me, where he was just like, it would have, where I imagine most people would have been like, okay, good, I don't have to wear this anymore. He was like, no, everybody gonna know. Yeah, that's amazing. I just I I'm gonna repeat myself, because I think it's fascinating for you to like learn so much, and for you to like just there's such as a connection, and the work that you had to do, and maybe how therapeutic it was for you. So I'm gonna repeat myself into how fascinating that was, and how amazing that was, not only for you to like put in the work and to make sense of it and to organize it, because it was like just looking at the family tree that you include in the beginning. It's so much. It's so much. And then to be like, okay, at what point, did they convert, and then why, and then who didn't convert, and that was a thing. And that was just because it was funny while I was like running my errands and stuff earlier. No, it was like yesterday, I think. So I do, wine tastings as like part of my like me time. And then I like, they know, like a Cooper's Hawk. I don't know where you're from, but I'm like in Chicagoland.
I'm
So
outside of Washington, D.C.
okay, okay. Oh my God. So you like gold mined of of anything you maybe ever want to know. So I will like doing these, I go there once a month because I'm like a wine club member, and so they like when they know that I bring my book, and I have my wine tasting, and I'm good to go. Like, just don't worry about me, as long as we're all on the same page. And a couple of them are readers, and so they'll be like, "What are you reading? What are you reading?" And I was telling them about your book, The Politzer Saga, and I was like, so get this. So I was describing it, how I was like, she found out her family was Jewish when she was in her late 20s, and then like, but she was raised Catholic, and then some years later, some decades later, she found there was a house fire, and she found some, physical evidence, photos, materials, documents, all of that. And then she went back and searched for it, and this is like her project that she came up with. And everybody like who I talked to, either like my wine pourer or like the manager, they were like, that is so crazy. That's fascinating. Oh, cool. Like, they were all about it. They were all like, I got so much good energy, like so many like positive responses when I was telling them, because they're like, what are you reading?
Oh, that makes
And
me
I
feel
told them
so
about it.
good.
Yeah.
That really
Yeah.
makes me feel good.
No, they were
Thank
like,
you.
they're like, oh my God. They were like, I could see their face light up when I was like, okay, then I found out. So it's so cool to like see all. I forget. No, never mind. I forget where I was going off on a tangent, but it was just so cool to like tell people about it, and they were like, "What?" And so I imagine that's like an extension of what you were feeling like throughout all your research, all that, every step of the way, and trying to figure out how to like, okay, how do I structure this? How do I organize this? Like, what makes sense? What doesn't make sense? That kind of leads me. I know I'm going to backpack all over there. Regarding your research, and I know there's a lot to pick from, what stands out to you as like the maybe most surprising or the most fascinating that you learned while researching?
That's such a hard question, because I think it's going back, and just the fact that each and every one of these characters had such, they lived through such cataclysmic events, right? And how they responded, way back from Isaac, who I start with, and then just, you had mentioned Moritz, who was then murdered by Napoleon soldiers. And it's just each one of these. But I think, I think what's really was surprising to me was you think you know your parents and how little I actually knew about their lives. And I think that was the most shocking, because one of the most shocking things was that my father had actually served in a Nazi labor camp and then, and escaped. And when he escaped,
And you never knew this until you started
I
asking
knew
questions.
I knew nothing about it, and my father would never talk about it ever.
I understand that, but still, like,
Yeah, the fact that he, and because in the box I found some letters between my mom and my dad during that period, and they weren't married yet, but they, as I had
they were
mentioned,
still like,
they
oh,
were
the little
engaged.
lovebirds.
Yeah, they had,
Yeah.
he had proposed to her the day before he went off, so they were
Oh my
engaged. But
God.
the letters are heartbreaking, and the kinds of things that he lived through, it was just shocking. But then, then he escaped, and they were captured two more times, and I don't know how, but he escaped with five other men, and how they escaped, and how they escaped after they were caught twice more, and then how they made their way back to Budapest. I mean, it's a complete mystery. And some of these other people, the one of the five men that he escaped with became a world famous economist, and he has a website. And also on his website, also what he says is, "We were in the labor camp. The labor camp got bombed, and by miracle we survived and we escaped." And that's all he would say. And these guys must have had a pact, because they never spoke about it. And
Maybe
this
they did something they're not proud of,
yeah, well,
and
who
yeah,
knows what happened? I'm sure
right,
they
yeah.
faced some more incredible trauma. But what's interesting is, so the economist's son became, they call him the Hungarian Bob Dylan. Apparently, he was an incredible musician and very popular. And then one of the other gentlemen he escaped with became a world famous pianist who was known for his Liszt and Beethoven performances. And his son actually reached out to my dad and said, "Could you tell me more?" And, again, there was this pact of
Oh,
silence that they wouldn't
oh,
go there. So it's really interesting. But I do want to tell one story, if you still have some
yeah.
time, because this is this is one story I learned, and to me it's just an incredible story. So somehow so you have these six men, somehow they got food, not food, but money and clothes, and were on the train back to Budapest. And they ended up sitting in the same car as a Nazi soldier. Now, all of these guys were very well educated. They all spoke German. So they're having this great conversation with not this Nazi soldier, right? So when the officer came in to get their tickets, he didn't disturb them, because he figured, oh, they're with a Nazi soldier, so that was probably something that saved their butt. But when they arrived in
You can
Budapest,
swear, it's okay. I don't mean to downplay what the story you're talking about. I'm saying go for it.
but when they arrived in Budapest, the Nazi soldier turned to them and said, "I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been a great conversation," and said, "I wish every Hungarian was just like you."
So he knew.
He didn't know. He had no clue that they were Jewish. He had no clue that they had escaped from a Nazi labor camp.
Oh my God. So he just treated them, he thought that they were straight up just like normal Hungarian people, like not on the run, not Jewish, not somebody that he should be looking out for. Oh my God.
Isn't that's just, I mean, it just tells
What a
you,
lesson. What a lesson. And like, oh,
right? So I just think that's an amazing story, right?
that is wild. Yeah, absolutely. Because it's just like, that kind of situation can be applied to so many others. It's just like, yeah, when you sit down and get to know them, oh, I wish all your people were like you. Like, most of them are. Like, what? You're fighting a fruitless war. Like, what? You're following blind orders to people that you would get along with otherwise. Like, it's just so.
Right. Yeah,
Oh,
no, it's amazing. It's amazing. And that to me says it all. It's like, we're all just human. We're all just connected. We're
it
all
really.
people, and we should just accept each other as such.
I know. I mean, that's just. I already kind of like, because I'm like half Mexican. My mom's family, half of her family is from Mexico. Half of them was like from Texas, but my maternal grandmother, her side was in Texas before it was Texas. Like, their generation, they go generations back, where it was just like before that purchase that happened, where the border was moved. And so it was funny. Like, my mom kind of jokes around, like, nobody's gonna kick us out, like nobody's gonna tell us to go nowhere. We've been here. Like, but it just reminds me of that. We're like, okay, so you're people are put in certain situations where they don't have any control over, or they're just for survival. And it's, I guess, obviously in America, like, you're gonna get people from all walks of life. You're gonna meet people from all walks of life. Especially for me, like growing up in a Chicago suburb, I'm gonna get people from most, or at least a couple walks of life, like, depending on the neighborhood. But I guess I find myself fortunate that I grew up from a mixed family, a mixed background, and also just like a mixed neighborhood and stuff like that, where I'm like, I part of me kind of understands like the removal of that. Like, oh, all people of this skin color are like this, or all people who are from here are like this. And it's like, no, I think unfortunately a lot of what drives behavior is poverty, is lack of resources versus skin color. Because you know what I mean? Like, that's kind of like, at least in my life experience. And like, we don't need to go down any rabbit holes. We don't need to get too political, other than talking about your very political. But even so,
But
I
I
kind of
think
like
it's
try
the
to reflect on my own.
Yeah, no, I think it's the, we are a country of immigrants, and I think we're so much richer for the diversity and the different cultures and so on. I mean, it
It's
can only
seriously,
help us, not, we shouldn't be fearful of that.
I so I agree that it should be regulated, but like, it's helpful for our economy, 100%. I'm not against regulation, but I think it's necessary, for sure, for sure. And it's just like, it sucks when the powers that be, are using that as an excuse to whatever. But anyways, I'll just aside from that, I'll just ask a few more questions before we hop off here. This has been, it sounds like, I feel like we could talk for like ever, but I want to be respectful of our time. So I'm gonna throw this at you. What were the most challenging parts to write? What were the most enjoyable parts to write?
Oh my goodness, that's a great question, and I don't know quite how to answer it. I think part of the challenge was, I think maybe the chapter on my great grandmother Margie, because she was this amazing person, and when you look at what she lived through, it makes you cry. It just makes you cry. I mean, she was just a remarkable person, and she grew up she was born in 1876, so she grew up in that golden era of Budapest, and and benefited from her father was Ignaz Misner, the lawyer that we spoke about, and benefited from his success. But then she lives through World War I, and she becomes a nurse, and for her to become a nurse was a big deal, at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
It just sort of showed her she's an incredible philanthropist and did so much for people. But she lived through World War I, and then after World War I, there were two revolutions that were horrific. And the second one was called the White Terror and targeted Jews and was as bad, if not worse, than the Holocaust. So she
Mm.
survives that. She becomes a widow because her husband died, and we never really figured out why, but I suspect that he may have been a victim in the White Terror. But then there's sort of this period of time where things are good again, and then the Holocaust happens, and she survives the Holocaust. And after the Holocaust, then there's she tries to rebuild. She has to her the big house in Pest was bombed. She's her villa is gone, her farms are gone, all of this. So she loses not only properties, but she lost probably 40 or 50 family members were murdered during the Holocaust. So she's trying to rebuild, and then the communists come in and she gets expelled. And at age 76, she finds herself expelled to a farm where she's expected to work on a farm, both she and my grandmother. So, as someone of just an indomitable spirit, an incredible person, and so it was, yeah, it was heartbreaking actually to write that chapter, but also really rewarding, I think. So at the same time, because I felt like I could honor her. I
Yeah.
felt like I could honor her. So,
I know, because just from you telling me that, I'm just like, my attitude is like, burn it all down, fuck everyone. Like she had no choice, just to like kind of comply and to like rebel silently and to like but it's just like who would have known, like, if she would have were allowed to flourish, if she were just allowed to live a normal life, like who knows what she would have accomplished. And unfortunately it was just like not just like the things that she had to overcome for her identity, but just for being a woman. And that's, yeah,
absolutely.
it's so messed up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
What advice do you have for people who might be in your situation, who are kind of digging into their ancestral background and maybe trying to put a story together? Maybe not necessarily in a book, but just trying to piece together things. What advice do you have for
Yeah,
them?
and that's another really great question. If there's still family members living, I would really, ask. And I will say, when I asked, I this web of secrecy that it was so hard to penetrate. But I wish I had just been more persistent and asked and asked and asked. But a lot of those people are gone, and so you don't always have that opportunity. I have to tell you, I was so lucky finding Andras Kaczynski. Without him, I don't think I could have done
The
what I
sleuth?
did.
Yeah.
So I think finding that help, and there's other Andrashes out there. There are a lot of people I think who
Yeah.
have done this. I couldn't have done it on my own. So I was really lucky. I was blessed to have found him. So
It's like find your resources, find your people, embrace them,
right,
and yeah.
exactly.
Because oh God, I can't imagine you trying to like do things on your own. It's like you have limited knowledge, you have limited notes,
Exactly. Yeah,
and
a
to
lot of
talk
it.
to people who like have been keeping notes,
Right.
like yeah.
Well, some of it was the language barrier. So you need somebody depending on where they're, investigating. And there is one other piece of advice, and that is really read up on the history. Because I think when you know understand more of the history and what was going on and why people made certain decisions, I think it's really helpful to really
Oh,
understand that
absolutely.
context. So history's so
Absolutely.
important.
I think that's maybe what we miss in traditional history lessons is like the context.
Right.
Like I mentioned earlier, the psyche, like
Exactly.
we're like, yeah, we get information about how events happen, but it's like to one specific person or family's experience is like how it affects them. And then you can like relate to that. You're like, okay, yeah, you're looking at like my parents and my brother. or my parents and my brother and then their kids. It's like you can like kind of put it yourself in that situation to be like, oh shit, like this is you have to worry about them and they have to worry about you and they're keeping secrets from you, but then you kind of understand why. And then like 40 years later, they're still keeping secrets. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like, it's so helpful to learn that the context. You're absolutely right. Yeah. 100%. So, Linda Ambrus Broenniman, what is next for you? Are you working on anything that you could talk about?
Well, it's really interesting. When I wrote the book, I actually wrote a lot more than what got published. And I had worked with an editor, and the editor said, "Well, this is really two books, so you need to split it apart." So at some point, I will
You're
go
like,
back.
what?
I'll go back and sort of say, "Okay, let's put together that second book." So yeah, yeah,
Okay. Oh, that's exciting. So you're back to the drawing board trying to figure it out. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so the Pulitzer Saga, that book is available now. Linda, thank you so much for sharing and for being authentic and for your you remembered everything that I mentioned. I was like, okay, what about this? And you were like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Like that's so much. It's so much to remember, but I recommend this to people who can share your history, your background, or anybody who's just kind of curious about nonfiction in this period appropriate history. Well, even though it spans generations, I recommend it. You're a good storyteller. You were able to figure it out and to put it on paper. And when and if you figure out how to how to do your next one, feel free to come back. I'd
Oh,
love to
thank
chat
you.
again.
Thank you, Megan, so much. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
And there you go. That was Linda Ambrose Broenniman talking about her book, The Politzer Saga. That book is available now. Check out the show notes where you can find links to purchase the book online, where you can find Linda online, where you can purchase the book as well. Please do find Cantina Book Club online and on social media, cantinabookclub.com, if you want to check up on book reviews or see anything else that is coming out of the blog and the podcast. Rate, review, subscribe while you're finding your favorite podcast player and the books and all that good stuff. It really does help everyone out. And as always, thank you guys so much for listening.